The sergeant looked for Candelario. He kept backing along the ranks, but he couldn't find him. He nudged his horse through the column and moved up the far side. The lattermost of the drovers were now coming through the dust, and the captain was gesturing and shouting. The ponies had begun to veer off from the herd, and the drovers were beating their way toward this armed company met with on the plain. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides the painted chevrons, and the hands and rising suns and birds and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now, too, you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones. And some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the off-side of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers, bearing shields bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniforms still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools. "Oh, my God," said the sergeant. A rattling drove of arrows passed through the company, and men tottered and dropped from their mounts. Horses were rearing and plunging, and the Mongol hordes swung up along their flanks and turned and rode full upon them with lances. The company was now come to a halt, and the first shots were fired, and the gray rifle smoke rolled through the dust as the lancers breached their ranks. The kid's horse sank beneath him with a long pneumatic sigh. He had already fired his rifle, and now he sat on the ground and fumbled with his shot pouch. A man near him sat with an arrow hanging out of his neck. He was bent slightly, as if in prayer. The kid would have reached for the bloody hoop-iron point, but then he saw that the man wore another arrow in his breast to the fletching, and he was dead. Everywhere there were horses down and men scrambling, and he saw a man who sat charging his rifle while blood ran from his ears. And he saw men with their revolvers disassembled trying to fit the spare loaded cylinders they carried, and he saw men kneeling who tilted and clasped their shadows on the ground. And he saw men lanced and caught up by the hair and scalped standing. And he saw the horses of war trample down the fallen. And a little white-faced pony with one clouded eye leaned out of the murk and snapped at him like a dog, and was gone. Among the wounded, some seemed dumb and without understanding, and some were pale through the masks of dust, and some had fouled themselves, or tottered brokenly onto the spears of the savages. Now driving in a wild freeze of headlong horses, with eyes walled and teeth cropped, and naked riders with clusters of arrows clenched in their jaws and their shields winking in the dust, and up the far side of the ruined ranks and a piping of bone flutes, and dropping down off the sides of their mounts with one heel hung on the withers strap, and their short bows flexing beneath the outstretched necks of the ponies until they had circled the company and cut their ranks in two. And then rising up again like funhouse figures, some with nightmare faces painted on their breasts, riding down the unhorsed Saxons and spearing and clubbing them, and leaping from their mounts with knives and running about on the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot, like creatures driven to alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead and seizing them up by the hair and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike, and snatching aloft the bloody wigs and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals. Some of the savages so slathered up with gore they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some who fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. And now the horses of the dead came pounding out of the smoke and dust, and circled with flapping leather and wild manes and eyes whited with fear like the eyes of the blind. And some were feathered with arrows, and some lanced through and stumbling and vomiting blood as they wheeled across the killing ground and clattered from sight again. Dust stanched the wet and naked heads of the scalped, who with the fringe of hair below their wounds and tonsured to the bone, now lay like maimed and naked monks in the blood-slaked dust. And everywhere the dying groaned and gibbered, and horses lay screaming.